We're getting some breaking news.
Apparently, Michael Jackson suffered cardiac arrest this afternoon. He was rushed to UCLA Medical Center.
At 12:21 this afternoon, the Los Angeles 911 operators took a call, a need for a medical emergency at the 100 block of Candlewood Drive.
According to Randy Jackson, Michael Jackson collapsed.
Multiple sources are now saying Michael Jackson is in a coma, and we're just getting this in right now.
Pop star Michael Jackson has passed away. This is according to the TMZ website. This indeed will be shocking news for millions of his fans throughout the world.
For 2 months before he died on June 25, 2009, Michael Jackson was immersed in rehearsals for his This Is It concert series. The series, due to kick off at the O2 Arena in London on July 13th, was intended to mark Michael's grand return to the stage after years of absence due to health issues, legal battles, and personal struggles, and to re-establish him as one of the world's biggest and most marketable stars. However, behind the scenes, Michael faced numerous challenges. His personal reputation was in tatters because of child molestation accusations and other bizarre behavior, and his popularity as a musician and performer was at an all-time low. He hadn't had a top 10 song for 8 years, and his last number one, You Are Not Alone, was way back in 1995. Michael felt enormous pressure to deliver a perfect concert performance. But concerns about Michael's physical and mental health were mounting. He had long struggled with chronic pain and insomnia, conditions that led to his heavy reliance on prescription medications, including the powerful opioid, Demerol, and the anesthetic, propofol. Propofol, which Michael referred to as milk because of its white, creamy appearance, is not intended as a treatment for insomnia, but Michael had been using it to induce sleep for over a decade, including every single night for the last 2 months under the care of his personal physician, Dr. Conrad Murray. And as the concert date grew closer and the stress of the tour and the physical demands of the rehearsals intensified, Michael's need for consistent sleep grew more pressing, and his drug use intensified along with it. On the afternoon of June 24th, with just 3 weeks left to go before the scheduled launch of the concert series, Jackson met with executives for the music promotion company Anschutz Entertainment Group, or AEG for short, to discuss This Is It's financial expectations, and AEG told Michael of its vision for him to perform a mind-boggling 186 concerts, for which he would personally make hundreds of millions of dollars. The physical effort required to perform that many dates would be enormous, even if Michael was in tip-top shape, which he clearly wasn't, but he desperately needed the money. His flagging career, coupled with an extravagant lifestyle and expensive legal fees and settlements, had buried him in debt, and he saw the tour as his only way out. After the meeting with AEG, Michael went to Staples Center in downtown LA for rehearsals. He went through his usual vocal warm-up routine and then took the stage. For the next few hours, Michael went through an exhausting rehearsal of 3 songs, Dangerous, Thriller, and Earth Song, and approved a number of set designs. According to his musical director, Michael Bearden, MJ worked particularly hard that day and was in good form. After months of rehearsals, Bearden said, quote, "You could see his confidence growing, and you could see physically he was able to do all the things he wanted to do." The rehearsals wrapped around midnight, and Jackson pledged to return the next day at 2 p.m. when he would do a full run-through of the show. His vocal coach, Dorian Holley, later recalled that when Michael left, quote, "He gave me a hug, and he was just like, I love you." I said, "I love you too, Mike," and he walked out of the arena. And that was it. Michael got home just after 1 a.m. in desperate need of sleep, and like every other night, Dr. Murray was waiting for him. Michael showered, put on pajamas, got into bed, and immediately asked Dr. Murray for drugs to help him sleep. Murray would later tell police that even when Michael was calm, he was physically incapable of sleeping without medication. But tonight he was particularly amped up, and he knew it would be difficult. And in fact, it would take Michael a full 9 hours to fall asleep that morning. Beginning at about 1:30 a.m., Dr. Murray administered to Michael a hodgepodge of powerful sleeping and anti-anxiety meds, but nothing worked. Jackson begged for propofol, which Murray initially refused because he was trying to wean him off the drug. But at about 10:40 a.m., with Michael still wide awake and the day's rehearsals only a few hours away, Murray relented and gave him the propofol, and he immediately fell asleep. Dr. Murray told police that after Michael dozed off, he left the room to use the bathroom, but when he returned, he found Michael was not breathing and was in full cardiac arrest. Dr. Murray performed CPR and gave him drugs to counteract the prior medication, and then instructed Michael's security guard to call 911.
Sir, we have a gentleman here that needs help, and he's not breathing yet. He's not breathing, and we're trying to pump him, but he's not. He's pumping his chest, but he's not responding to anything, sir. Please.
Okay, we're on our way.
First responders arrived and took Michael by ambulance to UCLA Medical Center where, at 2:33 p.m., having never regained consciousness, Michael Jackson, arguably the single most talented and successful musician of all time, was pronounced dead. He was 50 years old. I'm Jason Beckerman.
I'm Derek Kaufman.
This is part one of a two-part episode of Last Days, Michael Jackson.
At 2:44 p.m. Pacific time, 11 minutes after doctors at UCLA pronounced Michael Jackson dead, TMZ broke the story. It became by far the most trafficked story in the website's 4-year history, and CNN called it the biggest pop culture moment since OJ's white Bronco chase 16 years earlier. The demand for information quite literally overwhelmed the internet. Google's software mistook the unprecedented volume of searches for Michael's name as malware and stopped surfacing results. The LA Times saw its servers crash despite the fact that it waited hours to report the death. It was one of the first major stories of the smartphone era, and it spread like wildfire on social media. Twitter crashed, and Facebook recorded its second biggest one-day traffic event in history, surpassed only by the election of Barack Obama. Jackson's death was arguably the biggest story in the history of the internet up until that time, and the New York Times said it was, quote, the biggest thing since the death of Elvis. It had the same impact as the assassination of John Lennon. It was one of those tragic, seminal moments that define a generation. And as we discussed last week, it eclipsed the death of Farrah Fawcett, who died earlier that morning after a long battle with cancer. Farrah was extremely famous, and for a few short hours, news of her death was the lead story on every website in the country. But then Michael died, and in an instant, Farrah was largely forgotten. You know, Jason, before his death, the perceptions of Michael Jackson were, to put it mildly, very, very complicated. He'd twice been criminally prosecuted for sexual assault on minors in 1993 and again in 2003, a decade later. Now, he beat those charges both times. The 1993 charges, the grand jury just refused to indict, said they didn't have enough evidence to move forward with the case. In 2003, there were charges, but he was found not guilty.
They went to a jury, and the jury found him not guilty, right?
So, you know, he had faced these two public sort of criminal episodes in his life. And given the fame of someone like Michael Jackson, the coverage was intense. I remember the 1993 sort of, you know, that didn't even result in charges. And yet there was omnipresent coverage. It was the beginning of seeing Michael as more than just an entertainer and sort of learning about sort of his
pulling back the
behind-the-scenes
curtain
life
on a lot of that life that we always knew was a little bit strange because his parents were strange. The Jackson 5 was a little bit odd all the time. But then the molestation claims come up in 93, and there's a lot of sort of sideways glances. And then 2003, he's actually prosecuted, and he hops up on the back of the car at the court event. I don't know if you remember that, but it was just it was a mess.
And you look, we're in media. Even when you're found not guilty in a hugely public trial, there are scars from that whole ordeal. You can think of O.J. Simpson was found not guilty. Obviously, the story of the criminal trial followed him for the rest of his life, regardless of the verdict.
And also, it came out at about the time that he paid $15 million to settle another child molestation accusation. Now, he said it was just to try and keep it quiet.
This was Jordy Chandler.
Right. He knew what it could do to his career. But it's hard to look at a $15 million settlement and not think maybe there was some fire there.
Yeah, why'd you pay the money? And the public became aware of the lurid accusations that had been levied by minors against Jackson, and many minds were made up, frankly. When you hear these allegations, there's a rush to judgment, and that certainly happened in Michael Jackson's case, in large part because he was a strange guy. You know, the skin tone that was lightning, people knew he was eccentric, the bubbles
he
stuff.
He married Lisa Marie Presley earlier.
Yes, everything started to sort of lock in place in people's minds at least.
And then there's testimony that comes out that shows that although it wasn't criminal, or there wasn't proof of criminal activity, I guess, because the jury acquitted him, he would sleep with young boys in his bed at Neverland. He insisted it was completely non-sexual. He would also play these games. I remember these stories coming out where he'd have these secret passageways at Neverland, and he would be in the secret passageway with the young boys for long periods of time. Again, no proof of criminal conduct. He insisted he just loved kids. He loved being around them. They brought him joy. They kept him youthful.
He gave interviews about this, by the way. So there are very famous clips of Michael Jackson talking about, like, you know, your head's in a bad place if you think sleeping in bed with young children. We're actually playing
that's
games.
on you, not on me.
That's on you, not on me. That sort of explanation. But it started to concretize in people's minds a view of Michael Jackson as a child predator, frankly. And throughout this time, he was also exhibiting just more and more bizarre behavior in public. He had lots of plastic surgery. This is very well reported that altered his appearance literally month to month. He was lightening his skin. His nose
was
head
wasting away.
narrowed
Yeah.
and to such an extent that it was almost a caricature. He appeared publicly drug-addled, which, in light of what happened to him, turned out to be largely true. He would sort of stumble around or just seem slower. Michael Jackson was such a vibrant presence during his prime that to see him in this state, people knew he was struggling. He had had incidents where he had damaged his hair in a famous Pepsi incident, so he was on some painkillers from that. And in 2002, there's one that really sticks out in people's minds. He was on the balcony of a hotel, I believe, in Germany, and there were shrieks of crowds around him who were calling for, Michael, show us your baby. And most people might just wave to the crowd. He had been famous for a long period of time, but he actually took his youngest child, the child that they call Blanket, and 9 months old at the time, and he sort of waved it over the balcony. He says later that he got caught up in the moment and he was just sort of like feeding the adoring crowd, but it's a very jarring moment.
Scene. He's so frail, and Michael's so frail looking, and he's extending his arms and holding
over the
his
railing.
Baby over the railing of this balcony that had to be 40 or 50 feet above the ground below, shrieking fans below it. And there was that gasp, sort of horror coming from.
They couldn't believe it.
And he later said, he just got caught up in the moment. And he apologized for it, but it was something that somebody who is in their right mind is not doing. It's the only way to look at it.
It really stuck in people's minds that this is a man who was coming untethered and slowly destroying his life and career. Old friends started distancing themselves from Michael. The diehard fans even started abandoning him. I mean, he was past his musical heights because, as you said, in 1995, he had his last #1. So people started to say, this guy's old and weird now. Sort of like Howard Hughes, who was this massive figure, and now he's sort of this eccentric weirdo that we're going to leave. And by 2009, a whole generation of young people just knew him as that weird guy who molested kids. They didn't really think of Michael Jackson, the pop star from Thriller, and no one was in his corner preaching the greatness of Michael at the time of his death.
But when he died, all of that vanished. His music again became ubiquitous on radio stations, and his album sales soared. Candlelight vigils were held in cities around the world, and people again spoke of him as a musical genius. The child molestation accusations that dogged him for the last 20 years of his life weren't entirely forgotten, but there have been no meaningful efforts to really cancel Michael Jackson, and he remains firmly established to this day as an unquestioned member of the Mount Rushmore of modern music. Musicians and other celebrities who knew Michael well, but who had, to varying degrees, remained silent during the last 15 years as his life and career faltered, spoke adoringly about him after he passed. Quincy Jones, Jackson's longtime mentor and friend, and the producer of Jackson's 3 most iconic albums, Off the Wall, Thriller, and Bad, said, quote, "I am absolutely devastated. I just don't have the words. He was a consummate entertainer, and his contributions and legacy will be felt upon the world forever. I've lost my little brother today, and part of my soul has gone with him." And Elizabeth Taylor, long Michael's closest friend, said her heart was broken. "I love Michael with all my soul, and I can't imagine life without him. Highly intelligent, shrewd, intuitive, understanding, sympathetic, generous to almost a fault, he was the most loving, caring, kind soul I knew." Also mourning were Michael's parents, Joe and Catherine, his 3 children, Paris, Prince, and Blanket, and of course his 8 siblings, each of whom expressed both tremendous grief over their brother's passing, but also outrage over the manner of his death. Michael's sister LaToya quickly became the channel through which the family vented their collective anger. Days after his death, LaToya emphatically stated, quote, "Michael was murdered by a conspiracy of people. I will not rest until I find out what and who killed my brother."
As it turns out, the LAPD had the same thoughts as LaToya, and from the moment of Michael's death, they treated the case as a criminal matter. They got search warrants allowing them to collect UCLA hospital records and evidence from within Michael's home, and they raided Conrad Murray's house and his offices, as well as the offices of various other doctors who had prescribed drugs to Jackson. Detectives also spoke with scores of potential witnesses, including, most importantly, AEG, who had hired Dr. Murray to care for Michael, and Conrad Murray himself, who agreed to speak with LAPD detectives just a day after Michael died. The transcript of the LAPD's interview with Dr. Murray would later become the centerpiece of the criminal trial against Murray, and of a series of civil lawsuits Michael's estate and his family would later bring against Murray, AEG, and others. Jason, Murray's decision to speak with cops just a day after the death was clearly a mistake. We're both lawyers. This doesn't turn out well. I remember thinking the exact same thing when Alec Baldwin decided to give an interview in the wake of the Rush shooting because he needed to rehabilitate his image. He knew the press was bad. I can understand from a public relations standpoint the desire to speak, but when you have a pending criminal investigation, that's going to go poorly. We'll discuss the criminal trial more in the next episode, but the transcript of that June 26th interview was devastating for that trial. And I think it's very plausible that had Murray refused to talk and waited for the evidence to be gathered, He could have crafted a more logical story that was more consistent with the evidence and would have been harder to disprove. And instead, when he spoke the day after, emotions are running high, his timelines were off. He was caught in a number of half-truths, outright lies that really came back to haunt him. And obviously, he had no obligation to speak with the police. I mean, he wanted to seem as though he was cooperating with an investigation and that he had done nothing wrong. So he wanted to tell the cops, I will be open with you about what happened because I don't believe I'm at fault here. That really speaks to the fact that Conrad Murray went into that interview with that conviction, because otherwise there's just no reason. No good can come of it, because once the prosecutors get their hands on that transcript, they're going to tease it apart.
There's a reason you will always be advised, if you ever pulled over for DUI or whatever it is, keep your mouth shut.
That's it.
Because nothing you can say will ever help you.
People hear that everything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. That's part of the Miranda warnings. That's true.
Right.
That's how lawyers work.
Right. And the evidence, Conrad Murray, he didn't know what the evidence was going to show. He didn't know a lot of details, but he went in just headlong. And a lot of it turned out to be wrong. Some of it because he tried to shade the truth, clearly. A lot of it also because he just didn't know what other drugs he had in his system. He didn't know the timeline of events. There was a lot about Michael Jackson he didn't know. And he got caught up in saying things that just turned out not to be true, and it made him look like a fool, and it made him look guilty.
It really did. Now, I want to say that Conrad Murray, I believe in his heart of hearts, he's given a lot of interviews in the subsequent years. I think he believed that he was giving Michael the best care he possibly could. You know, he said he was hired by AEG for $150,000 a month with his only instructions to be available to MJ 24/7 and to make sure he was capable of rehearsing and performing for the This Is It tour. But Murray soon realized that keeping Jackson healthy would require far more effort than he or others could have ever imagined.
By the time Conrad Murray came on the scene, Michael Jackson had been a drug addict for 25 years, ever since he'd suffered second and third degree burns to his scalp during a pyrotechnics mishap while filming a Pepsi commercial in 1984. Michael underwent reconstructive surgery on his scalp, as well as multiple subsequent skin grafts, and it was during his recovery that he was first introduced to opioids. For the next 9 years, from July 84 through mid-1993, as Michael created some of the greatest pop music in history, he was consumed by opioids, and they very nearly killed him. Michael took prescription painkillers nearly every day and became so reliant on them that he was often physically incapable of getting out of bed without a fix. He went on 3 world tours during this time: the Victory Tour with his brothers in 1984 as a swan song for the Jackson 5, the Bad Tour in which he spent the better part of 16 months on the road between 86 and 88, and the Dangerous Tour between 92 and 93. On each of these tours, Michael would travel with one or more physicians whose job it was to keep him pain-free and performing. One of those doctors, Stuart Finkelstein, would in 2013 give deposition testimony about his time with Michael on the Dangerous Tour 20 years earlier.
I attempted to give him a shot of Demerol, but his buttocks was so scarred up and abscessed that the needle almost bent, in which case at that point in time I ran an IV and I administered some IV pain medication.
And do you recall what IV pain medication you administered?
Morphine.
Michael was so drug dependent during the Dangerous Tour, he began suffering shortness of breath and exhaustion, and was eventually forced to cancel the tour's final dates in 1993. Later that year, Michael at long last checked himself into rehab, publicly acknowledging for the first time an addiction to painkillers.
As you may already know, after my tour ended, I remain out of the country undergoing treatment for a dependency on pain medication. This medication was initially prescribed to see the excruciating pain that I was suffering after recent reconstructive surgery on my scalp.
But Michael's sobriety didn't last long, and by the late 1990s, he was again hooked on painkillers. But now he had added intravenous anesthetics to the mix. It is not known exactly when he first started using propofol, but there is evidence that by at least 1999, he was obtaining large quantities of the drug from multiple doctors. Some of these doctors administered the drug to Michael at their offices, where he would then sleep, and others, like Dr. Murray would a decade later, would come to Michael's house to do the job. Michael also learned how to find his own veins and insert his own IV needle, and then self-administer propofol.
That is crazy. The fact that he would lie down at bed, be able to hook the propofol bag up to the IV stand, take a needle and find his own vein, tie it off, inject himself, and just fall asleep with a drip in his arm is
It's baffling to not do this in a hospital setting, to just be in the comfort of your home with some medical equipment like that. I think he had no idea of the sort of danger that he was in with the power of these drugs, the combination of opioids plus the anesthetics. I mean, what they're doing is slowing everything down in your body, including your heart rate and your breathing. Yeah. And you're just rolling the dice at that point with those dosages.
But to your point, he couldn't go to hospitals. He couldn't really go to doctor's offices, because when you use that much, good doctors will stop you.
Yes,
you create a record. He was obviously hounded by the paparazzi and the media constantly. That would have been found out, and he just couldn't take those risks.
It's really tragic. I think of him and Prince in similar ways. They were such entertainers. They were in constant pain because of the what they put their body through on stage. Yeah. I mean, the Pepsi incident is one thing, but just the dancing, the impact of the long tours, they're in pain. They're also so famous that they can't manage hospitals, and they're surrounded by yes men because of the enormity of their celebrity status. It's really just a potent combination for these kind of tragedies. And this really became Michael's desperate routine for the last decade of his life. He would shoot up opioids during the day and then use propofol to get him to sleep at night, all the while becoming sicker and more frail. He was able to cajole, manipulate, and sometimes bribe doctors to get him whatever drugs he wanted and administer them recklessly, and too many doctors were either too enamored with his stardom or his money to ever say no. Chief among these doctors was a very famous Beverly Hills dermatologist by the name of Arnie Klein, who counted among his clients Liz Taylor, Carrie Fisher, and countless others. Klein performed a number of legitimate dermatological treatments for Michael, and the two became very close. They actually went on vacation together and celebrated Christmas. A bizarre bond for two people who met as a doctor and patient. For years, Klein shot Michael up with enormous quantities of various painkillers, including, in particular, Demerol, which he justified as essential to minimize the pain of Michael's numerous dermatological procedures. Here's Klein on TMZ Live 5 months after Michael died.
Administer Demerol because you have to understand that the procedure I do are painful injections. And I would say I would take an hour and a half to inject him, and I would do somewhere around well over 100 facial injections on it.
But Arnie Klein would later be proven to be little more than a drug pusher and a liar who happily performed minor cosmetic procedures on Michael Jackson as a pretext for his administration of what Michael really wanted, Demerol. Toward the end of his life, Michael was going to Klein's office 3 to 4 hours per day, multiple days per week, and would emerge so high on Demerol he appeared zombified. Klein's records show that Michael received at least 51 Demerol injections within the 3 months before he died, and each injection contained 300 milligrams of the drug, described by one doctor as a dosage large enough to knock out a horse. 51 injections in just 3 months. Michael was so burdened by his addiction to Demerol that he actually released a song in which he sang about the powerful hold the drug had on him.
This won't hurt you before I put it in. Close your eyes and count to 10. Don't cry, I won't convert you. There's no need to dismay. Close your eyes and drift away.
And so this is the world Conrad Murray walked into in March 2009. A drug-addled star profoundly addicted to both Demerol to make him feel better and propofol to combat the insomnia that came with it. When Murray met Michael Jackson, he desperately needed to be hospitalized, and everyone knew it. Conrad Murray knew it, and so did Arnie Klein, as did both AEG and Michael Jackson himself. But more pressing for the latter two was that there were hundreds of millions of dollars to be made on the This Is It tour, and it was up to Conrad Murray to get him through it. None of this is meant to excuse Conrad Murray's conduct, which we will discuss in more detail in part 2 of this episode. He was beyond reckless, and had he done better by Michael, the singer might still be alive today. But the blame for Michael Jackson's death extends far beyond the man who happened to be sitting by his bedside on the day he died.